Hola, and welcome to another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. What we're going to be talking about today is a strategy that can be used with gifted students known as differentiated learning centers. So, what is a differentiated learning center? So, let's start first with what a learning center is. The way that a learning center typically works is a teacher sets up stations or centers all around the room, and students go to these stations or centers to do their learning. This learning is very independent. There are clear instructions at the stations or clear tasks at the stations. So a student goes to one of those and knows exactly what it is that they need to be working on. And so a teacher might have 6 different stations or centers in her classroom, and the students will then rotate through all of those. So they might spend 15 minutes at one, 45 minutes at another, and so on and so forth. Sometimes this time can be very prescribed, where the teacher says you have 15 minutes at each station. Sometimes this can be self-paced, where a student figures out, oh, okay, I'm done with this one. I can move on to the next one. I can spend more time there because I spent less time at the other one. So it depends on how you want to set it up. And it can be set up for any subject area and for any level of student.
Hello and welcome to Teachings and Education Learning Centers, a teaching strategy. Students explore interest while working self-directed activities. So, why should teachers use learning centers? For most classes, learning center activities will give students a chance to work in differentiated groups. It will also be a form of cooperative learning. One of the most important reasons for using learning centers is to be able to focus students on specific learning activities. Teachers can pinpoint various content, steps in solving math problems, or even focus on certain types of reading and writing skills. Why not shake things up by doing learning centers as a lesson? From my experience, students have always had fun with learning centers. Although many teachers assume learning centers are meant as a whole class activity, it can be set up for individual students that need extra help in a specific skill or a certain topic. Next, how to use learning centers. For the purpose of organization, title each learning center so students know what they are walking up to. Since each learning center is different and will have different assignments, make sure you have the necessary supplies and materials that students will need at each center. When teachers are creating assignments for their centers, they need to consider their students' academic readiness and their prior knowledge. Your students need to first be prepared. Even if you have students academically prepared for the material, teachers still have to put rules and procedures in place. Students will need to be held accountable for their classwork. Teachers must require them to submit their work. The assignments at the learning centers, actual assessments. Students should be given ample amount of time at each learning center. Provide students with even amounts of time at each center. Although some research has recently debunked learning styles, teachers may still want to make a learning center predominantly visual or auditory or kinesthetic. Right now, I'm going to present you with the 5 most common learning centers used in a classroom, mostly elementary. The most frequent example of a learning center is for writing skills. Here, students are usually given a prompt and asked to draft, write, and proofread. Everybody knows the importance of math on both the student individual success and on the success of the school as well. Have students work on a number of things from addition to word problems. Learning centers are great for students because they're also fun. Therefore, add a center where students can explore their own interests, such as have free time to play, games, or read, etc., and so forth. A science center is just another example of a possible learning center. In the spirit of making these centers fun, have a demonstration and an experiment put in place, and have the experiment aligned to the curriculum. Lastly, we have a reading center. Reading should be enjoyable to the students, so provide them with options of books and texts to read. Also, have an assignment for them to complete as well. Now, these are just a few examples, but you can come up with your own examples as well.
When you're working with gifted students, though, and you're doing differentiated learning centers, you have to have different tasks. That's what differentiation means, is to do something differently. So you have to have different tasks within the same station. So what this means is you may have a general task that you want students to do when they go to a particular station. However, you might have something that goes above and beyond that. So something that is asking students to take what is learned at that station and either apply it or analyze it or evaluate it, or but using higher level thinking strategies to get students to challenge themselves about this. So it's not just completing the task, it's taking the task to a different level. And this is going to be very helpful for gifted students, especially who have the potential and the ability to work at this higher level. It can also work with typical children. Just because a typical child is coming to the center doesn't mean that they can't choose this option that is above. You might also have, to differentiate even further, depending on what kind of class you have. If you have a mixed ability classroom, you might have scaffolding. So you have an even simpler tasks at the bottom, and students will scaffold their way up there. And some students will have to start at the bottom and work their way up. And they may not get all the way at the top. Some may start in the middle. Some may start at the very top. But the idea here is that because it's differentiated, a student self-selects which one they're going to do. And you as the teacher then would encourage, if you have a student who is kind of taking the easy way out, they have the ability, but they're not challenging themselves with those higher level tasks, then that's something you could talk about in your station where you talk to students individually. But the idea behind differentiated learning centers is that the teacher doesn't have to be in front of the room teaching the entire time. That students are kind of learning how to learn by going to these centers and teaching themselves about something or learning about something through reading or whatever, however the center is set up. There's some things you need to consider as components of a differentiated learning center. First is choice. So when a student comes to the learning center, do they have choice in what it is that they're doing? So if you have these different tiers of mastery or different tiers of levels of thinking, do students get to choose where they're entering in? They may need some coaching with this at first, but if you set your learning centers up correctly, students will get used to the idea of choosing the one that they feel is most appropriate for them. But this is going to teach kids autonomy, and it's going to allow them to challenge themselves at the same time. Second thing is you have to have different levels of thinking going on. So in other words, you can't have 5 different levels of tasks at the center, but they're all the same level of thinking. Using Bloom's taxonomy as a guide, it would be good to have some that are lower level thinking skills, such as comprehension and understanding, some in the middle, which is application and analysis, and some in the higher level, which would be creating and evaluating. So that's one way you can set it up. But keep in mind that you are asking kids at different levels to do different types of thinking, because that is where the challenge and the rigor comes in. And an assignment like that is that the level of thinking that a student is doing. You want to have the option, you don't have to, but a nice thing to do is to have a student created option. So in other words, student comes to the center, maybe they start at the top and they decide to start there. Is there some place for them to go further that they can create? So what is something that they can come up with? I never wanted to limit my students to my own imagination and my own thinking. They are good. They are, good thinkers, and they can come up with ideas as well. So do you have options where students can create those themselves and take the learning even further? They should be self-paced. The video talked about how it should be timed, but at the same time, I prefer to give students a deadline. Maybe a class, like 50 minutes long, 50 minutes, or you maybe have a couple of days, or maybe have a week. I'd rather give them a deadline and let them set their own pace. Because students need to learn this executive functioning skill of pacing themselves and prioritization and making sure that they are working, getting their work done in an efficient manner. So if you prescribe the time, then that's going to be very artificial in the way that they set their time. But if you allow them to self-pace, you might get some students that finish early and they can move on to the next station. You may have students that maybe need a little longer, and so they'll take a longer time at this station. But the self-paced aspect lets students decide for themselves what that's going to look like. Lastly, another component to consider is that your tasks at these stations should be open-ended. If there's nowhere to go, especially the higher level ones, if there's nowhere to go, If there's a ceiling on the learning, then students aren't going to be able to take it to the next level because they're just buttoned up against the ceiling. So these tasks need to be open-ended, where students can take it to a different place, or where there's not just one possible answer, but there are several possibilities that students can come up with. And like I said, these open-ended tasks might be more prevalent in your higher level thinking, rather than your lower level ones can be close-ended, where students are just finding information out. But if when you get to those higher levels, you're going to have open-ended tasks in order to do that. So here I am today with Erin Muck, who has taught gifted education for several years. And she recently started using station rotations with students, and she developed what she calls the read process. So Erin, why did you develop the read process, and what does it look like?
Well, I developed the read process initially to help organize my classroom, because with English language arts there are so many different standards that we have to cover, and I always felt like some of those standards were falling to the wayside because of time restraints. I also felt like as we were working together as a whole group, I was noticing that some kids were done in a couple minutes and other kids took 20 minutes and then they were just sitting and waiting. And so I kind of decided to pull together the rotation to allow for flexibility for the gifted learners. And so I developed read. It fluctuates between read and reads, depending on if I have to teach social studies as well. But each of the different letters represents each of the different standards that I would have to cover. So R is reinforced reading and writing standards. That would focus on their independent reading. It would focus on iReady, which is a curriculum program that we use. E is focusing on expanding their vocabulary. It focuses on developing an interactive notebook, and they're working with Greek and Latin stems and other high frequency words that they need exposure to, not only just in the content area, but for their own independent reading. A is about the language, the grammar, sentences, the writing, pulling that all together. And D is about demonstrating their thinking skills, and that is where I incorporate the reading standards, the novels that we read. And then if it's a year where I'm teaching social studies, then I add on the S, and that is where they are studying their social studies standards. It allows me to make sure that I'm covering all areas. It allows me to meet individually and in small groups. It allows me to introduce something as a mini lesson, and then they can go and explore the topic on their own. I also was finding that some of these standards that the kids needed to know, they could pick up quickly. They didn't need me in the front of the classroom teaching them the curriculum. They could pick it up, and then I could just follow up with those who might be struggling. And so it was allowing them to go on their own pace. When I first started the stations, it was a rotation where I was setting a timer, and every 20 minutes we would rotate. And I found that wasn't quite working, because some of the kids would finish in the station, some wouldn't, and then they were left with a lot of hanging pieces. And so we kind of talked together as a group, as a class, about just self-pacing themselves, and they could decide what station they wanted to start with, how they wanted to progress through the work. Some students like to piece it. Some students like to do an entire station for the week. But it gave them a choice on how they wanted to progress through. The biggest benefit is it allowed them the ability to work on their independence, their time management, their ability to collaborate and problem solve. While they are working, I am also here to support them. Sometimes they just need to sit and work with their peers. They don't necessarily need me hovering, but I'm available. They can ask me questions when they need it. And then it allowed me an opportunity to pull small groups. So if I'm checking in work throughout the day, I notice someone has it, they can keep going. I notice someone else is struggling, so I pull them over and do a little bit more exploration with them. But it gave me a lot more one-on-one time with the kids that really needed it. And the kids that didn't, it allowed them to keep working and growing as a learner instead of sitting and just waiting for the rest of the class to be finished.
So you talk often about when you pull small groups or you work with individual students, it's the ones who are struggling. are there instances where you're pulling kids that you want to challenge, or kids that you feel need a push to that challenge?
Yes.
They're not struggling necessarily, but you want to get them to that next level.
Yes, I think initially when I started, that was my reason why, so I could have that dedicated time to be able to work with them. But I meet with all kids. When we're doing our reading standards, oftentimes it's in small groups. I pull them to my table, and we are doing the mini lesson together. They're having a discussion with a smaller group, and if I'm pulling the kids, I can pull them together based on where I think they can go, how they need to be pushed. It also allows me flexibility because then I can do literature circles. So last year, we didn't have a class novel. I was offering 4 or 5 books of the same genre. The kids got to pick, and then that's how I determined my reading groups. I could have multiple of the same book, and they knew what day they needed to be ready, and I would pull them on that day, and we would do our lesson, and we would have our discussions.
So you just talked about literature circles and them getting to choose a book. How much choice do students have in these read stations? Like, is it prescribed step by step how they have to do them, or do they have a lot of choice within the stations?
I'd like to think they have a lot of choice within the stations. I try, because I think that's the biggest thing to get them to take ownership of their learning is when they have that choice. There is no prescribed order, no prescribed order in regards to what station they start with. So you could walk in my classroom at any time. I could have students working on R, I could have students working on A or D or S or E. It doesn't matter as long as they're working. What matters is they progress in the order as items are listed within the station because they build upon one another. So if there's 3 things that they're working through in one station, they do need to go in that particular order. But I try to offer choice within the stations as well. So if it's a station E and right now we're learning verbals, gerunds, participles, and infinitives. So I will offer choices on how they can demonstrate their understanding. It could be a paper pencil task, it could be a computer task, it could be a variety of games that they can select from. But they have a choice in how they want to demonstrate their understanding of the material. So they have different options within. And hopefully I'm providing a level of difficulty within those choices. Some tasks might be a little bit easier than others, and they can determine which one they would like to tackle.
So it sounds like they're doing each of these stations kind of independently in its own vacuum. How do you bring that all together for them to get the overall sense of what it is they're supposed to be learning?
Actually, this year has been a great learning experience in how I am continuing to evolve in regards to this reads process. I feel like every year something different is changing and happening, and I always reach out to the kids. And one of the things I've really appreciated about being in this hybrid learning situation is that at the end of our learning week, we have been bringing everything back together as a whole class. I appreciate that whole class interaction between me and them. The activities are a little different. It's not me instructing, but reviewing and really being able to see as a whole, okay, where we are on the different learning standards. And the kids like that whole group interaction as well. So they're going to have their learning throughout the week, and then we'll bring it all back together on that last day. I also will be doing some instruction at the beginning of each day to kind of input some of those more difficult standards that need more direct guidance, but not for the entire period, maybe 20 minutes worth where we're working together. And then through that, I'm able to see what are they picking up, what are they still struggling with, and then that'll help guide the instruction that'll take place the following week.
So it sounds to me as though you're not just exclusively doing stations. There is some direct instruction. So it seems to give you a lot of flexibility where I need to spend this much time, but here I only need to spend this much time. And so you yourself can differentiate, what the needs are for your students. And I'm sure it changes from class to class too. Is that correct?
It is. There are classes that take a little bit more time. I know that they're not going to get through it as quickly as another class, or the explanation needs to be a little bit different, so that does have to vary. But yes, I tried to tackle different approaches because you have different learners in every classroom. And some of those learners need that direct instruction. And they also need to learn that independence too by working through the station. So I do try to tackle all modalities within the course of a day or the week.
So when you're working with your gifted students, so you've worked with gifted students for many years.
A long time, yes.
Many years. So you have just started this the last few years. What have you found by making this switch to this? It's allowed you to do that you couldn't have done before, or what did it allow you to do that maybe you weren't doing as well as you were doing before?
Meet one-on-one or in small groups to really get to know the kids as learners and really be able to understand their strengths and weaknesses. But it allows the kids to take ownership of their learning. And I think that is a big thing for our gifted learners. And I have learned that they really appreciate that. They really enjoy and love that experience. I love providing them that opportunity to determine what path they want to go on and that self-pacing. Gifted students don't need us standing in front the entire period. They need to explore. They need to be able to tackle things on their own and learn those problem-solving skills. A lot of times it just has come naturally to them. They just know how to do it. And so presenting them with opportunities where they have to problem solve has been very beneficial.
Have you seen students, because they have more choice and they have more say in what they're learning, challenging themselves more and going deeper into things, or what are you seeing with students?
Yeah, I think overall the kids will challenge themselves to keep learning because you're doing something different. They decide, well, I want to do this task because I prefer to do it this way versus another way. And I think that they stay engaged throughout the class period.
So final question. So if there was a teacher that decided they wanted to try this, it doesn't have to be read. We had a person doing math that had math rotation, MATH. How would you suggest that a teacher start in this process? Because you started and very organically it evolved over the last couple of years, but how did you get your start?
I actually kind of just jumped right in. One day, I was already doing stations and centers. You know, I think a lot of teachers already do that, but evolving to the reads and the self-pacing, that took a little bit more time, and it really was the kids that helped guide me those first couple years. I really reached out to them. And I think the biggest thing is you have to do what you are comfortable with. I personally am one that I just want to get in. I want to see how it works. If it doesn't work, we'll fix it. Some people, they don't want to do that. That makes them uncomfortable. And so you could just start with what you are comfortable with. It could be presenting centers, maybe one day a week. Maybe you start it by timing them and then kind of seeing how that works for you. And then you can progress to that point where you feel comfortable, where your kids could be working on different things at different times and finishing up. I think the biggest thing that I hear from teachers is about the management. And again, that is all what you feel comfortable with. My students check in with me throughout the entire period. They're finishing a station, they come in, they check in with me, I see how they're doing, and then they go on to the next station. But really it's about your comfort and what works best for you because everyone's in a different situation.
So there you have it, differentiated learning centers. And these are great to use with a mixed ability classroom where you have kids at various levels that are going to be entering at different parts, and you may want to get different things from them. So it works really well there. It's also really good, like I said before, for teaching executive functioning skills. So teaching kids how to learn for themselves is really important. So this can be used with all grade levels, for anything from kindergarten all the way to seniors in high school. But you have to set these centers up to whereas there are multiple possibilities within a center, not just one task that is done at the center and it's all done the same way. Those aren't differentiated learning centers. So what you don't want is students to every 10 minutes rotate and everyone's producing the same product or the same idea, or the same learning. You want to make sure you differentiate that within that.